This weekend, Indiana Center for Middle East Peace is hosting We Are the Earth, Environmental Justice is a Moral Imperative. And one of our keynote speakers is Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis. Reverend Liz, welcome to Fort Wayne.
Thanks so much for having me here. It's a beautiful city you live in.
I want to encourage everyone to read your article that came out on April 21st in Tom Dispatch, entitled The Poor at the Crossroads, which I think brilliantly lays out the urgency of the work of the Poor People's Campaign in the U.S. today. So I want to ask you just a few questions about that and the work of the Poor People's Campaign.
Awesome.
The Poor People's Campaign recently issued a devastating report along with the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. And so I just have a couple of questions about the report. First, why did it take you? Why didn't the government agency issue this study? Why did it take the Poor People's Campaign to do it? And why hasn't the mainstream press even been screaming its finding in their headlines and on the news shows?
So this Poor People's Pandemic Report that we launched actually on April 4th, the anniversary of the assassination of Reverend Dr. King, points out very clearly that who has been impacted the most, from 2 to even 5 times as many deaths are happening amongst poor people in poor communities across the country. And it is really, just awful, devastating, that it did take poor people and together with, economists and policy folks to point that out and to actually do the research. It was not easy to do, in fact. The CDC and our public health institutions have not been and still are not collecting any data about the impact of COVID, the worst public health crisis in generations, on poor and low-income people. There's no data around income or jobs that is collected. And so, throughout the pandemic, we started to notice how, of course, because of underlying pre-existing conditions like racism, like poverty and low wages, like the lack of health care, this was actually some of the fissures that this virus spread that then impacted not just poor people, but all people across the society. I mean, we live in the richest country in the world. We spend more on healthcare and medical expenses than any other kind of wealthy nation. And yet, we have, before the pandemic even started, 87 million people who are uninsured or underinsured. So should we be so surprised? No, and we weren't, because throughout the past couple of years, we have stories of a young woman in Mississippi who has lost 25 people just in a couple block radius of her home. I have someone who works for me at the Kairos Center who has lost, over the last couple of years, because of COVID and the lack of health care and poverty, 43 family members and close friends. This is who is been hurt first and worst, just like other injustices are. And it took, a bunch of folks that are trying to organize to kind of shift the narrative and build a movement to be able to point out that our society has gotten too accustomed to, too comfortable with death, especially when it's the death of poor and low-income people.
Poor counties, you write, have experienced twice the number of deaths as higher income ones. And that's not even at the height, that's just the run of the course, because of their social and economic conditions prior to the pandemic. And you reference, and you just began to do that, disparities in healthcare access, wealth distribution, housing security, jobs, food insecurity, and the like. You want to just tease that out a little bit more for us?
Yeah, so what this report shows, and I encourage people to actually go to the Poor People's Campaign's website, because most of this...
And the report is there.
The report is there, and the report is surely written analysis, but a lot of it is actually these interactive maps. So you can go and look at your county, your community, and see, a whole host of things. How many people are poor and low income, according to kind of data collected. How how many people don't have health care or have inadequate health care, the racial demographics, and a series of other information, including COVID deaths, right? And what you see when you start to look on these very, very micro, but also on macro levels, is that every wave of this pandemic, other than that first initial wave, which was brought about because people are traveling all over the world and the country, every wave has been a poor people's pandemic. And at the deadliest waves, 5 times the number of poor people from poor communities died to richer people. And again, that this can't be explained just by vaccination status. What we found was that in poor communities and in rich communities, people are not vaccinated, and in poor communities and in rich communities, people are wearing masks and aren't wearing masks, right? All of these things, these are important, and we in the Poor People's Campaign, from the beginning of this pandemic have been talking about equity and health access and vaccine access. But vaccination alone isn't the reason for why the richest country in the world, has about a fifth, a sixth of all of the deaths across the world. It's because of underlying injustices and issues. And, the communities that have raw sewage in their yards, the communities that have poisoned water, the communities that have high rates of homelessness and housing insecurity, the fact that people were low-wage workers that are have not seen a raise in this pandemic, but who were the first to go to work, the first to get sick, the first to die, and have continued to have to work and basically service people that other folks haven't had to, bear the brunt of this pandemic. All of those contributed to this kind of perfect storm of all of this death and devastation, in communities that were already experiencing death because of poverty and inequality before the pandemic even hit.
I want to transition to Dr. King's speech, his Beyond Vietnam speech a year before he died. The first half, he talks about why he's now coming out and criticizing U.S. involvement in Vietnam. But it's the second half of the speech that really is some of the most powerful words that he has spoken. That's where he addresses the giant evil triplets. Mm-hmm. Now, with the contemporary Poor People's Campaign, the giant evil quintuplets, I would put it.
That's right.
He says Vietnam is just, quote, a symptom of a far deeper malady within the American spirit. So I know this is a big question, so you pick wherever you want to enter into the question. But the quintuplets, right? Racism, economic exploitation, militarism, mm-hmm. Christian nationalism, and ecological destruction. Each one of those we get. But the power of what King began to do and the Poor People's Campaign is trying to show that these are interconnected. They're interlocking. Mm-hmm. Racism is part of militarism is a part of the ecological degradation. I mean, can you give us a couple of examples of some of these interrelationships? You don't have to do all 5, but how some of them are interrelated.
Yeah, I think it's really important, what Dr. King points out with those triple evils, and that what we in the Poor People's Campaign, a National Call for Moral Revival, are talking about with these 5 interlocking injustices. And he says that, the weak point, the Achilles heel of a system of militarism and economic exploitation and racism is to unite those that have been hurt the most, who have little or nothing to lose, who are the poor of the United States, the poor of the world, but across geography, across race, across issue area. And so indeed, the way we can see some of these intersections and the way that injustice plays out, I mean, if we look at the militarization of our world, the fact that the U.S. spends 53 cents of every discretionary dollar on war and military expenses, and less than 15 cents on education and healthcare and living wage jobs and anti-poverty programs combined, right? I mean, so you see the connection between what Dr. King talks about, turning the war on poverty into a skirmish, right? Like defunding programs of social uplift while you are doubling, tripling, quadrupling the funding for war. And what that does is not leave society, communities any safer. It actually disrupts them and makes them more violent. So you see this connection between militarism and poverty, but you also see what he talks about is the cruel manipulation of the war, of the poor. Sorry, because you have poor Black and white and Latino people, coming together and fighting and killing poor, in that case, Vietnamese and other folks, but then poor white and Black and Latino come back to the United States and can't even live in communities together. And so you see this racism and how it connects to kind of a militarized system. And then if you see that some of the biggest polluters of the world and some of the biggest destroyers of the earth is our congressional industrial military complex. And you see the devastation, not just today, but throughout history of the earth and everything living in and on it from militarism. You start to see how these are all interconnected. And then we bring up this false narrative of Christian nationalism, right? And it kind of blames poor people, blames immigrants, blames queer people.
The worthy poor.
Yes, the deserving and undeserving, right?
As opposed to the unworthy.
Exactly, and pits us against each other, right? Says that we have more in common with folks that are making money off of war than with each other. And then feeds us this lie that this is as good as it gets. Yeah. That we're really living in scarcity, that we don't have solutions to the problems that are at hand, when that's just a lie. That's what it is. And so and then covers it with religious rhetoric and theology. I mean, it's heretical, but it proves to be able to kind of pull it all together and explain it and say, if God wanted to end injustice, then God would have done so, and and kind of justifies, just like
we will
always have with you.
And
right?
You've written a book about that.
Indeed.
Well, I want to ask you about this just to follow up. The Poor People's Campaign, of course, is open to people of all faiths or no particular religious affiliation, people of goodwill.
That's right.
But Dr. King and Reverend Barber and you are Christian pastors. Tell us about the role of your Christian faith in critiquing the heretical theologies that undergird the problem, but also that inspires you in your work.
So, indeed, the Poor People's Campaign has folks from across religious traditions, but I do come from a prophetic Christian tradition where I was raised to see my faith linked to practicing social justice. In the words of Micah 6, what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and love kindness and walk humbly with your God? And I have learned a lot from many people, including Reverend Dr. Barber, the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign. And he says two things that I think really speak to this. One is, he says, why is it that in our society people of faith pray, P-R-A-Y, over folks that pray, P-R-E-Y, on the poor and the marginalized, on the downtrodden? Because, when you look at our biblical and theological traditions and foundations, if you were to cut out justice for the poor from the Bible, it would fall apart.
Right.
It's every fourth verse is about justice. And the ending of poverty and the flourishing of humans and of the earth and everything living in it. And yet it's been distorted in a way that often makes it unrecognizable, but then that's who you hear. That's what and so another saying that Dr. Barber says is, many of our faith leaders, especially Christians, have gotten so loud about what the Bible says so little about, and so quiet about what the Bible, it has at its center and core. And I think that's true, and that's why we and our Muslim and Jewish and Sikh and Hindu brothers and sisters are looking back to some of these theological and biblical, foundations and the kind of constitutional moral values that of freedom and justice and liberty, and saying, actually what we need is a moral revival of these kind of great values. And that means health care for all, and that means living wages, and that means to study war no more, and that means, to lift people up. We have this saying, when you lift from the bottom, everybody rises. And that's like reading Deuteronomy, right?
Exactly.
I mean, that's what our traditions say.
I have one more question.
Great.
You and Reverend Barber have issued a call to, using Dr. King's language, join the Poor People's Campaign as a drum major for justice at the Mass Poor People's and Low Wage Workers Assembly and Moral March on Washington and to the polls on June 18th this summer. Tell us about what you're hoping for. Tell us about the June 18th Assembly and March on Washington, and give us our charge as people who work for justice.
Awesome. Well, I'm hoping that everybody that is hearing this and seeing this and experiencing this will join us indeed on June 18th in Washington, D.C., right on Pennsylvania Avenue, where we're building a stage for poor and low-income people from every state across this country to put out their stories and the solutions that are coming out of our communities to really lift the load of poverty and declare that everybody has a right to live. And so we're hoping that this will be the largest gathering of poor and low-income people and their allies in U.S. history. And it needs everybody, because the fact that there's 140 million people in this, the richest country in human history, who are poor and low income, almost half of the population, means that we need to make a noise. The fact that we have fewer voting rights today than we did 55 years ago, and our democracy is in peril, means we need to make a noise. The fact that families across the country can get unleaded paint and unleaded gas, but there's still millions, tens of millions of homes that have lead water in them right now, means that we need to make a noise. And so I'm hoping that everyone will come out and be a part of this, because what we see in history is that when people gather, in generationally transformative meetings, events, public witness, and especially when you see that coming from folks who have little or nothing to lose from the current status quo, helping to lead the charge, that this makes a difference, that this causes the nation's conscience to be pricked, and causes people to see that they're not alone in what you're going through, and that you can indeed make a difference. And so hoping that people will join us. There's buses coming from Indiana and across the country. You can go to the Poor People's Campaign website and sign up right now to get on one of those buses. There's folks that are going to march there and caravan there and do all sorts of ways of getting to DC. But
June 18th,
June 18th,
Washington,
2022. That's right, Washington, DC.
Reverend Liz, Dr. Theoharis, thank you for coming.
Thank you so much.
Uh-huh.